Hi, welcome to our panel on best practices in purchasing and financing an aircraft hosted by NAFA. I'm Lisa Poplawski. I'm a corporate and aviation lawyer at Lane Powell in the Pacific Northwest. NAFA is the National Aircraft Finance Association. It's a professional association centered on the finance of general and business aircraft. We have approximately 160 member companies that range from law firms to lenders, insurance agents, broker-dealers, title and trust companies, OEMs, aircraft management companies, really a very broad array of product and service providers that focus on supporting the finance of general and business aircraft. I'll be moderating our discussion today, and with me, your experts are four incredible women from four NAFA member companies. And we'll be talking to you about our best practices to make your aircraft finance and purchase transaction a successful one. By way of short introduction before we jump in, our panelists are Kathy Nyan, Director of Delivery Experience for Cirrus Aircraft; Debbie Mercer-Irwin, owner and founder of the title company Wright Brothers Aircraft Title, and owner of the trust company Aircraft Guarantee Corporation; Lucy Johnson, Senior Vice President and Operations Documentation and Servicing Manager for lender PNC Aviation Finance; and Suzanne Miners-Levy, a partner at the Boutique Aviation and Tax Legal Practice Advocate Consulting Legal Group, ACLG. So we have a lot to cover, a lot of good information to get across, and I will help keep us on track. Jumping in, we know that purchasing and financing an aircraft is no small endeavor. There are a lot of moving parts, and there are complicated layers from legal to regulatory to finance that you have to be paying attention to through the entirety of the transaction. So starting out at the beginning first, maybe even pre-transaction, you want to gather your support system. You want to put together your team of experts. Kathy, when we say put together your team, what do we mean and why is that so important?
Well, establishing your team beforehand is really important. There's a lot of things that you want to have in place before you actually go on to purchasing your aircraft. You're going to want a lender that is familiar with the aviation process. You're filing documents with the FAA, and sometimes just a general lender may not have the knowledge of the process. So an aviation lender is very important. You're also going to want to have an aviation tax advisor on your team. Now they can work with your CPA to assist you with that process. You're going to want to have insurance, both hull insurance on your aircraft, and if you have a hangar, you'll want to have hangar insurance. NAFA has a network of all of these professionals that can assist you with these pieces, but these are just some of the probably the top items that are important when looking for your aircraft.
And Lucy, from the lender's perspective, who should be on that team and who are you looking to for different areas of expertise to make the transaction a successful one?
Well, I would agree with a lot of the parties that Kathy mentioned. They're definitely important to us as well as a lender. And we encourage our customers to ensure that they engage those team members early in the process, prior to maybe even selecting the aircraft that they're going to purchase, whether it's a pre-owned or a new aircraft. And with mentioning pre-owned, I would also include engaging a very experienced dealer broker to help them. And as a lender that's primarily focused on aircraft financing, we can help and assist our customers in some of those areas. However, we do encourage them to engage their own team members and get that particular information, whether it's tax, legal, insurance, company. Depending on the use of the aircraft, they may need to engage a management or a charter company as well.
Right, lots of players, lots of different areas of expertise to lean on. So we have the team. Our second best practice then is to explore and think about your ownership structure. So we know it's not as simple as buying a plane in an individual or a company's name and then flying the plane or using it in your business without thinking about it more. It's quite complicated. So Suzanne, can you tell us why considering your ownership structure is so critical and how ownership structure might impact a transaction?
Sure. Understanding the right ownership structure is important because there are a lot of different factors that go into play in both the ownership and the operation of the aircraft. From a financing perspective, we need to make sure that the owner is able to secure financing And we need to understand what the relationship between the ownership entity and the various companies using the aircraft is going to look like. Most of our clients, or many of our clients and GA owners generally, are purchasing an aircraft to enhance their life in many ways and maybe operate it on behalf of multiple legal entities. And understanding that and the liability protection that we want to have in place and the tax consequences of various ownerships and how that might affect their ability to take deductions, all of those items go into play along with the finance piece when we're really thinking about how we're going to structure what company and who that company is owned by that will ultimately own the aircraft in title, and then who are going to be our various operators of the aircraft.
So what that company is owned by, who are the operators? Are there any other questions that a buyer should be asking themselves when trying to figure out the appropriate owner structure, or that questions that you walk through with them?
Absolutely. Generally, always we're interested first in what is driving the decision to purchase the aircraft and how do they want to use it? What's their mission look like? This can help in later decisions that we make as well. What does their mission look like? What company do they own or do they work for that might use the aircraft for business? And what is the structure of that pre-existing company? So when I say that, I mean, if it is a C corporation or an S corporation, that's going to impact how we're going to set up the entity that would own the aircraft. Is it going to be a subsidiary of one primary company? Will it be a standalone entity? And not to get too tax specific, but whether or not it's a Schedule C company or a partnership may impact whether or not some of the personal use will ultimately be deductible from a tax perspective. The deductions matter not just as a function of understanding the later financial picture, but because of the way that tax incentives can promote the purchase and place in service of aircraft, it's important that you understand how your structure will impact the future deductibility. That actually can help free up capital for the purchase itself. And so we go through this series of questions so that our clients understand that there are a lot of trade-offs in various ownership structures. That is, in some structures you might be able to use an expensing election, but then may have limitations on the deduction of your personal use. In other company entities, that is, if you want to buy it directly in an S corporation, you need to make sure your financing is set up in a way and your ownership structure is set up in a way to ensure that you're going to have basis in the aircraft and the aircraft loan. So that might require additional agreements or guarantees from the lender or to the lender by individuals in order to make sure that you understand that the tax consequences in place there. And it really is individualized buyer to buyer. As we've seen significant changes in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and even in the newest CARES Act, it really does impact how you might want to own that aircraft and any transferability and ownership. And we're seeing more and more co-ownerships. And so if we're going to do a co-ownership, we want to understand that from the very beginning because we want to make sure any financing that we secure for the aircraft is in the right entity name. The worst thing is to get your financing in the wrong name and then get to closing and not know who owns the aircraft. And then suddenly that can slow the entire closing process down and really impact the capital available to the company in purchasing and financing the aircraft.
Suzanne, where do buyers run into problems the most? Is it a lack of fundamental understanding of how important this is and understanding this early, or where do you see the most problems arise?
Sure. I think that we see the most problems arise twofold. The first one is eagerness to buy the airplane, right? So they're going in early. And this relates back to Kathy and Lucy's observations early about having a team set up early, right? They're excited to buy an aircraft. They want to bring in a tax or a lawyer at the very end to help with the closing. But maybe what they don't understand is that knowing how the title owner fits into the overall picture can really impact their buying power and how smooth the transaction is. So your first point, yes, an overall understanding can be a problem. The second place we see a problem, and I think that this will lead us to Debbie's observations is we can sometimes see a problem with them not understanding that there are some FAA restrictions on who can own and operate an aircraft if it's going to be owned within a company structure rather than by an individual. So making sure that they're meeting certain citizenship requirements and disclosure requirements that the company is comfortable with and they're comfortable with, and that leads to a successful closing on the aircraft.
Thank you. That's a great segue. Debbie, can you tell us how U.S. citizenship plays a role in owning an aircraft?
The FAA has requirements that you must be a U.S. citizen to operate an aircraft in the United States. And with Aircraft Guarantee, we're able to help that if, say, 2/3 of a membership of an LLC is not U.S. citizens, then we can assist in registering in the name of Aircraft Guarantee, and then we're owner trust in the transaction, which helps with the citizenship issues.
Okay, so a trust structure as a potential solution for maybe not meeting the citizenship test. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, can you walk us through the trust structure and how that works?
Right. Aircraft Guarantee would be the registered owner of the aircraft, and the beneficiary would be the non-citizen, and they would be the owner of the aircraft. They can have an operator that's different than the beneficiary. They can have a co-ownership structure inside the trust. And we go through the process of registering it with the United States FAA, and it's all approved and has been for over 30 years in registration of aircraft.
I see. Okay. So you have your team now. You understand how you're going to own the aircraft in a way that complies with FAA regulations. We haven't even talked about the aircraft yet, though. Some of you might be wondering. So with that strong foundation set up and that legwork, now is the time to find your aircraft. Kathy, can you tell us how you help a customer find the right aircraft for them and what kind of questions you're asking them, what the process actually looks like?
As Suzanne had mentioned, it's very important to identify the flying mission. You need to understand what the customer is looking to be able to do. What are their needs? Does it make sense to purchase versus rent? You know, some people start out renting and realize they're not getting the same amount of usage that they would like to if they owned it. So that's kind of a step. You know, they're getting advice from their flight instructor. They're getting advice from other peers that own aircraft. They're taking the tax benefits into consideration. So all of those pieces come into play when you're trying to understand what is the best aircraft. Then it's important to get up in the aircraft, to take a demo flight with the salesperson so that they can illustrate how the aircraft operates, if it works for their mission, for their needs. And then after the demo flight, you want to make sure that questions have been answered. This is the time for the customer to just fully understand that this purchase makes the most sense for them. And again, the sales team, I'm sure, is able to help with helping with some of the expertise of the team. But I think it's always beneficial to have that set up even before you get to the point of going on your demos and finding your aircraft.
Right. And selecting an aircraft is one thing. Affording an aircraft is another thing. So financing probably plays just as big a role in selecting the right aircraft for you. Lucy, can you talk to us a little bit about that and what you're looking at with your customers to determine what financing options are available?
Sure, I agree. And I agree with both Suzanne and Kathy in terms of the first step is the mission and the use of the aircraft. I think for any individual that is entertaining a purchase, that's the first question that they should ask themselves, and then engage the team as they look for those answers. And that could include your financing expert as well. You know, we have a lot of experience with the different types of aircraft that a customer may consider. You know, the financing options that we have an array of aircraft that we can finance anywhere from a turboprop to large cabin. And in terms of the structuring of their financing solution, it all depends on the aircraft type, the purchase price, the use of the aircraft. Do they plan on leasing? Do they plan on chartering? And then what's the breakdown for that usage? The whether they're going to fly internationally or keep the aircraft domestically as well, is taken into consideration. And as we look for those financing solutions, we're able to offer our asset-based transactions that we have that have been in place for years, and your traditional credit-based financing as well, which include your loans as well as leases.
Thank you. So for both, it seems like every answer is really going back to what is your mission? How are you going to use the aircraft? What are your ultimate goals? And having those conversations early can really help avoid some bumps along the road and make the transaction a lot smoother. So Suzanne, I suspect the answer is going to be yes, but are tax consequences, do those help determine what the right aircraft is? And does thinking about tax even play a role in deciding on what aircraft is right for you?
Well, yes, it does. You are exactly right. But we are very careful to say that we don't want the cart to drive the horse.
Mm-hmm.
The tax consequences really come out of a question of really ultimately, if you have a knowledgeable tax advisor, there are hurdles within or traps about setting it up correctly and making sure that you don't you don't somehow convert business use into non-business use because of an illegal leasing structure or something like that. But ultimately, the tax consequences are the questions you should be thinking about when you're selecting that right aircraft, when you are paying attention to whether or not you intend on having some charter use or some flight school placement use. Because from a tax perspective, our primary focus is going to be on, is this going to be an aircraft that is set up in a way that it can be used predominantly for business, and that any fringe benefit use can also be considered business use if it's non-entertainment use by executives. And that does play into actually selecting the aircraft itself as well. As I mentioned before, many of our clients are looking into, if not co-ownership structures, opportunities to purchase an aircraft that maybe another company may be able to dry lease or use in some other way. And that may drive whether or not you choose an aircraft that is very difficult to fly, that only you can fly, or that other pilots in your area can fly and may want to use the aircraft as well. It also leads to the question of, which is related to tax, when we look at an aircraft from a tax perspective, the question in the tax code is it ordinary and necessary? And really what that means is this aircraft going to be helpful or useful to meet the mission of the business? And how helpful or useful it is related to projected flight hours and mission, other opportunities to garner business use, and this question of either third-party leasing or charter or flight school use if you don't think that you can get adequate flight time. And so we've seen those considerations and tax consequences play into the ultimate selection of the aircraft. Also, understanding what deductions might be available both in the year of purchase to free up capital and in future years helps a taxpayer better understand and a business owner better understand how much aircraft they can afford and what's going to be the right one to meet a mission. Now, it used to be that the tax consequences may, for many businesses, have heavily lent towards not buying pre-owned because bonus depreciation, for say, used to only be available to new aircraft. The availability of bonus to apply to pre-owned aircraft, for those aircraft that are going to be predominantly used in business, can help free up a little bit the various aircraft that a buyer might look at in considering tax consequences as well. So understanding the deductions, what the projected usage looks like, and how some aircraft might lend towards third parties being able to get insured on the aircraft and actually able to use it, all help play into the right decision of choosing that aircraft.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So you found the right aircraft now, you have financing available. Back to you, Suzanne, can you talk about what's next? Now are we actually going to get to papering the transaction?
Yes, hopefully, right? We still get some end of the runway handshake deals sometimes. And I would not label that as best practices in aircraft finance or aviation, right?
I think we would all agree with that, yes.
So I don't think papering an aircraft transaction needs to be seen as this way to slow down a deal or make a deal not work. Rather, appropriate and timely papering of a transaction really helps move the process along and get everything lined up for the professionals who are going to talk a little bit more about how the transaction itself actually happens. So it depends on what aircraft you identify in your purchasing as to what document or name document actually comes next. Usually for our pre-owned aircraft, we're looking at a letter of intent, which is often a single page, but it lays out how the deposit is going to work and maybe how the aircraft will get positioned for a pre-buy inspection. What we always want to do is we want to make sure that both the buyer and the seller understand what they're agreeing to as early as possible and how the steps of the transaction will move through. When we're working directly with an OEM or a manufacturer, often that first document might be a purchase agreement. And we find that going through that purchase agreement with our client as a buyer and just making sure that they understand all of the next steps. This is often the time where if they haven't already secured financing, it's time, right? Now they have a projected purchase price and they understand how much capital they're going to need. And so it's time to get those lending documents going and also get that insurance in place. You know, we have a wide range from owner flown to professionally flown aircraft, but waiting too long down the pike to get your insurance documents in place is a mistake that we've seen some buyers make. So right now we're generally looking for a letter of intent or an LOI. Once we have an LOI in place, it's usually an appropriate time to make sure that if we haven't already been talking to our bank, that we're certainly doing so now. And the purchase agreement is often an important document, ultimately, once that is worked out, for our lender to have their hands on as quickly as possible so that they can also understand what the agreement between the parties is.
Thank you. So we have our aircraft transaction documents. As Suzanne said, they don't need to be seen as slowing down a transaction, and it, in fact, can iron out details and make everything much smoother. So our next best practice is to do your due diligence, and not in the sense of due diligence on the aircraft. Your inspection and your OEM should have already helped you get through that process, but we're talking about the best practice of due diligence when it comes to everyone's favorite thing, which is paperwork. We're going to start with title work due diligence. So Debbie, can you tell us about the importance of pulling and reviewing title work for an aircraft and why it might be a problem when some people save that to the very last minute?
All right. Yes, in the very beginning, we need to get that title work started. We need to get our FAA searches. We need to see the complete description of the aircraft and see if there are any open liens that are out there that have maybe not been seen over the years if the aircraft has been owned by somebody. And sometimes it can take some time to clear those liens, so we need to be prepared. And then with the International Registry as well, we need to go ahead and see if the aircraft is eligible for the International Registry, if we'll be filing when it is, we'll be filing, and we need to get the parties registered and make sure that we know exactly who's buying the aircraft. A lot of times the purchase agreement will be written as an individual as the purchaser, and then they'll change track and it'll be a company, and that can cause some slowdown as well. But when we get the title work going, that really helps in the beginning stages of the transaction because it can take a little while to clear title.
So start early, and when you do run into a cloud on title, Debbie, what's the first thing you recommend a buyer does?
We usually will go ahead and reach out to the seller to see if they have any knowledge as to a lien that may be against the aircraft, and if it's able to be cleared right away. Most of the time, 90% of the time, issues are not big issues, and they're able to be cleared up by simply reaching out to maybe a lien holder who didn't properly release the lien when the buyer, actually the seller, purchased it, and it can be cleared quickly. Now, a tax lien could take some time if there was an unknown tax lien filed and the seller wasn't aware. That can take some time, some issues. A lot of times the states won't file or let us file. They'll file directly with the FAA, and that can cause a delay. They don't do DocuSign a lot with the states. Each state is different, so that can cause a delay in time as well. We don't see it a lot, but it can happen.
Mm-hmm. So sort of investigating early, see who the potential players are that you might not have had any idea about,
yes.
and reaching out to them to get them involved to clear title if needed. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Lucy, on the lender side, what kind of due diligence is a lender going to conduct, and I guess when does that process start? Is it early? Is it toward the end? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's early. It's definitely on our sales side, as they're working with our prospects to um, with our financing solutions, they're asking various questions at that point. And then once the transaction is actually submitted through the documentation and underwriting process, then we continue that ongoing due diligence. So part of that is know your customer. You know, we're a regulated
Mm-hmm.
bank, and we obviously have regulations that we have to satisfy. And in order to do that, we continue to ask various questions. You know, the know your customer regulations, while they're the onus is on the bank. That's something that's important for any aircraft buyer. As they're working with the seller as well, they want to ensure that they are working with someone that doesn't have any negative news out there that they may not want to be tied to. And in addition to the know your customer, it also applies to the source of funds as they are bringing in proceeds for the purchasing of the aircraft. We need to ensure that those proceeds are coming from our borrower and or the operating company, guarantor, whoever's involved in the transaction.
Okay, is there anything that a buyer can do to make that process a little bit smoother? I think sometimes there's a sense of there's a lot of questions. Everything is moving so fast, and that KYC, know your customer process, is sometimes an afterthought, and it's our job. And we all try to get everyone to focus on getting that out of the way early. What can a buyer do beforehand to make that process smoother?
Providing complete, current, accurate information. We do find at times that we'll receive, for example, ownership of our borrower, and it will list certain members, for example, as the owners. Well, then once we do our due diligence, we'll find that, well, no, actually, it looks like there were some member transfers that have happened. So we then have to start asking additional questions based on that information that we find, whether it's obtaining the most current LLC statement that's of record at the FAA, or reviewing their organizational documents that they provided to us. So just ensuring that they have complete, current, accurate information, and then being available for follow-up questions as we're gathering that due diligence, because there are going to be questions that arise, and we just need to make sure that our customers are available and are prepared with those responses.
That's a good point. So provide accurate information and then remain available. And
Yes.
I love what you said about accurate and complete responses, a topic very near and dear to my heart as a corporate lawyer, this sort of idea of having your corporate house in order and your organizational documents lined up, your ownership structure, going back to the importance of ownership structure lined up. Really can make that process a lot easier for everyone. Before I move on from you, Lucy, I want you to talk to us about a loan document package, just a little bit. I know that the loan document package can be intimidating to some people, and especially in an aircraft-specific transaction, we have aircraft-specific loan documents. Can you walk us through a quick overview of what that package looks like?
Sure. And this goes in line with ensuring that you have an experienced team member, so an experienced aircraft lender, because they're going to know, as we do, exactly what documentation is needed in order to perfect on your aircraft. We have found, as we are refinancing a transaction, for example, where we're paying off another lender who doesn't have that expertise, and then they question lien releases and things like that. So having that experienced lender is important for your doc package. It'll ensure that you have the correct information that's needed in order to, not just from a lender perspective, be perfected on the aircraft, but also just from a customer perspective, that it has all of the right information based on their needs of the aircraft, their mission of the aircraft, their usage of the aircraft. So a standard package, we try to make it as easy a process for the customers as possible. So we don't want to, and no offense to any attorneys on the panel, but we don't want the documents to be over-lawyered. So we have on a standard transaction, whether it's an asset-based transaction or a credit-based transaction, we tried to provide some consistency there. Obviously, the structure of the deal will dictate some of that documentation. So we may or may not have a guarantee, but we'll have a standard promissory note, guarantee if it applies, a subordination agreement. That's something that's important to us. If there is an existing lease or a charter agreement in place, then we want to ensure that those parties subordinate their interest to us, whether or not they are perfected at the FAA and the International Registry. A security agreement and a pay proceeds or a closing statement, and then a resolution. And back to the importance of providing current and accurate information is having a resolution that is based on their organizational structure. You know, you can't have an LLC, for example, that the operating agreement states that it's member managed, and then on the resolution, the customer asks us, well, no, I actually now want to have a president sign. Well, if your organizational documents don't authorize or appoint a president, then you cannot have a president sign. So that's an important document to us, as well as from an FAA perspective for the citizenship requirements.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so we are working our way to the very end of the transaction. We are finally ready to close, and our last best practice is to make use of an escrow company to help ensure that the closing is a smooth one. So putting your documents in escrow and running the transaction through escrow. Debbie, you are our escrow expert. Can you describe what the escrow process is for us?
Absolutely. It usually starts with, we receive a copy of the LOI and the deposit comes to escrow. We start with also doing our KYC and OFAC of the purchaser and of who the registered owner is to make sure that the parties are all acceptable for us to do the transaction. So we'll actually get involved in the very beginning when the LOI is written, because the deposit has to be placed in escrow to start the transaction. We'll get our title searches all ordered like we talked about in the International Registry. We'll do our searches there. And we're getting closer to closing, and we will start preparing the documentation, the bills of sale, registrations of the International Registry as to the entities, to make sure if they're not already set up on the IR that we get them set up, collecting LLC documents if they're not already on file as a new purchaser. Sometimes they've already been involved with the ownership of an aircraft and sometimes not. The same thing with the registered owner, make sure that everything is in order and the current owner is still a member or manager of that LLC, if that's the case, or that the signatory parties match. We'll then get the application for registration ready and send out to the new buyer. So we are doing most of our documents through DocuSign. We don't really have issues with buyers or sellers and signing those documents. It makes their life a lot easier. And then we'll reach out also to the owner or seller of the aircraft if we find that there is a current lien on the aircraft, to get their current lender to provide us with the payoff letter and the lien release to hold in escrow so that we're ready at the time of closing. And those wiring instructions will prepare closing statements for both the buyer and the seller to approve, and from there, we'll wait until they've taken delivery of the aircraft. They're ready to set the closing. They know what's going to happen and when we're going to do this. Basically, we try to be ready before. We try to push the deal along and have everything in escrow so that when they are ready to go, they're not waiting on us.
Okay, that is a lot. So
Yeah,
it's fair to say that the escrow should be one of your team members from the very beginning. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, is the escrow agent, are they quarterback for one side or the other? Or are they more impartial observer? Are they somewhere in between?
We are in the middle. We work for both the buyer and the seller. We are an impartial person to the transaction. We don't work for one or the other. So
impartial, but pushing it along.
Yes.
Okay. And I can say from experience that it really can make or break a deal if you don't have escrow involved. It can be a real problem. So it's always best.
Yeah, Debbie, or anyone who wants to speak to this, maybe starting with Debbie, why do some people think that escrow is unnecessary, especially after this entire list of items that they help us accomplish you just listed?
Well, it's hard for me to understand how, if you were doing financing, that you wouldn't have an escrow agent involved that could do the filings with the FAA. everything must be perfected. And without the expertise of an escrow agent, I don't know how you would accomplish that. We do see a lot of maybe smaller transactions where somebody decides to buy somebody else's aircraft. They'll exchange the money, give a bill of sale, file it with the FAA, and then not properly fill out the documents. And then you just start a big, long process of trying to unwind or fix or create what needed to be created the first time at the FAA. So in my mind, it's hard for me to comprehend somebody not using escrow to buy an airplane, but it can happen. And I don't think it would happen when there's a manufacturer involved or a lender, tax person. I think all the professionals in this industry would use escrow to close a transaction.
There's definitely the importance of using escrow involved on a deal. There's a lot of moving parts. You know, you're trying to close simultaneously with releasing of documentation and releasing of funds at the same time. So having an escrow, one person there, and I do think, and I know Lisa, you mentioned being the quarterback, and I do believe that the escrow company, the escrow agent, is the quarterback and ensuring that all of the parties are all on the same page. So when we see a transaction that we are refinancing and we are correcting things that maybe were not done as best as possible, we do find that some of those were done without an escrow company. So I definitely see the importance of having an escrow agent involved.
Agreed. And Kathy, I know you already stated the importance, but do you also see escrow coming in for trading an aircraft? Can you tell us why that might be needed?
Sure. If somebody is buying a new aircraft and they are doing a trade-in, or what we refer to it as a pass-through, where we maybe aren't taking the aircraft in, but they are selling their existing aircraft, we always recommend escrow, because the seller cannot have possession of the funds at any time if they're looking to reduce their net taxable amount. So it's really important that escrow is set up and they're managing those funds, they're dispersing them and taking care of that side of it. So it's really important.
Okay. Our last topic, it's still on escrow. And Debbie, I want to hear your thoughts on this, but I think some people listening to this panel may have heard that the FAA now accepts electronic signatures, which is a very big deal. But some people might not understand why it's such a big deal. Can you tell us why and tell us whether it's helped or hurt the closing process and some things to watch out for?
I'll have to say it's really helped the transaction, because we're able to prepare those through either DocuSign or another digitally approved version of an electronic signature for filing with the FAA. It is able to, we don't have to wait on FedEx to deliver packages for that closing. We don't have to wait till after 10:30 a.m. and maybe get it. And if it's wrong, I mean, we're able to correct something that needs to be corrected and maybe resend out, and we get it back in the matter of minutes. It really has helped the speed of the process. It's a good thing, and sometimes it also creates a situation where a buyer and seller goes, okay, I'm buying an airplane today, I'm gonna send you the money and you can send out the documents. I'm like, no, it's not quite that fast, because we've got to do your title searches, make sure everything's clear, and you're gonna get free and clear title on your aircraft. But it really has improved the quality of what we do, and we're able to get things to the FAA quicker. It's just really made things a lot better in escrow and with closing aircraft transactions.
So it's helped the process. It's helped us react. I think if something's wrong, react quickly to correct it. But it's not a fix-all miracle that people can close transactions in the same day anymore, right?
No. I mean, I think that you still have to go through the process. There's a process of buying an aircraft, and that's still there. We're just able to make the process a little bit easier with getting signed documents into escrow to be held and not have to wait on different delivery services. You know, you can have a foreign seller, and we don't have to wait on a package to get here from Belgium that might take 4 days. You know, it can be done immediately at any hour. You know, you can prepare it and send it out, and during their daytime and we're sleeping, we can receive it. So it really does make the transaction a lot easier.
Suzanne, I see you nodding along in agreement. Is that your experience as well? Do you have any words of caution though along with it?
I do. Certainly, we're delighted about electronic signatures. I remember the days of the constant DHL packages kind of coming in and coming out, and then a member would change or an entity would change, and we would kind of start all the way back over. And having that process drive a deal is never positive, right? We always want to decrease that kind of transactional noise when we can, so we can focus on the aircraft deal. But I think it kind of takes us full circle to our very initial observation about having a really experienced team in place from the very beginning. Because if we want the deal to happen faster at the very end, which by the time we've identified that aircraft, gone through inspection, secured our financing, everyone wants to close quickly. But if we get to a quick closing, electronic signatures don't fix incorrect documents. They don't fix the problem of not having a good quarterback in the closing, right? So something that had been alluded to earlier in the financing realm is making sure you have an experienced bank working on it. We have gotten to kind of the end zone almost, and then had a bank call us and say, hey, can you take a look at my documents? Because I'm not sure that they perfect my interest in the aircraft. And I'm not neutral. I am not the quarterback. I have a client in the deal. And it creates an immediate conflict, but an actual conflict for me, because me just saying no to the lender, which ultimately I have to say, does create another roadblock of my client wants to close the deal. So they're annoyed that their bank is asking at the very end of the road how to perfect their own interest in an aircraft that my client is buying. And so it creates tricks all along. That's why I think the existence of faster closing at the end means that being thoughtful from the beginning will really help us move that deal along, because we do see things, unfortunately, sometimes fall through on one of the many dimensions of that what it takes to close an aircraft. But it should never have to happen after we've paid for inspections and we've located planes and all of those things have happened. So our caution with electronic signatures is always understand that that means if the closing is going to happen faster, you need to have everything in a row much earlier in order for escrow to be able to do their job and for the deal to close. So I appreciate getting like a 3 a.m. ping from DocuSign saying the buyer just signed, but I also understand that that means that client might be calling me the next day being like, I'm going to go pick up the airplane. And sometimes we need to say, hang on just a second. We all need to make sure that we're connecting to understand that you're getting what you understand you're getting, and that everyone in the transaction's needs have been met so that the closing can be smooth.
I think that is very well said, and really you summed it up nicely, that the legwork, the bulk of your work happens at the beginning of an aircraft transaction. I mean, all of the prep work, the diligence, putting together your team, investigating not just the aircraft, but all of the ownership, the structure, the tax. It's really front loaded, and the closing is fast, and there are a lot of moving parts, and the escrow's role is critical to help everything come together. But most everyone's work, including escrow, is done early on, and that really ensures a smoother, more successful transaction.
I was just going to add to that, Lisa,
please.
that yes, definitely very important to have all of your ducks in a row early on, and DocuSign does, or e-signature does not change the steps that should be done from the onset. I look at electronic signature as a solution to a way to get through that finish line, as Suzanne mentioned, in the event someone isn't available to sign and wet ink. Now, I think you can still use the solution as part of your process. And again, as long as you follow all of those steps up front, then the e-signature is going to be useful in the event, again, something changes and you have to then quickly get something out the door. You don't have to do the overnights and like Debbie said, wait for a certain time for documents to get there. I was pleasantly surprised how quickly the FAA did begin the use of electronic signatures. You know, I think we all remember back in the day with the carbon copy of the registration application. So that definitely made it a lot easier for all of us to proceed with the closing.
All right, that is great. You guys were so terrific. I know as NAFA members, we're always happy to talk about this and could talk for hours and hours about it. I just think hearing everyone's experience and best practices, using your expertise there's a lot to be learned to make a transaction easier. So thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
I think
you.
that's it. Thank you.